She stood in a ballroom full of diamonds and dirty money, wearing a smile that cost her everything, while her husband walked in with another woman on his arm and didn't even look her way. For 12 years, Vanessa Holloway built an empire in the shadows, so Damien Moretti could stand in the light. She bled for him. She lied for him. She buried pieces of herself so deep she forgot what she looked like before him. And tonight, in front of every criminal family in Chicago, he chose someone else. If you've ever loved someone who never deserved you, stay with me. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The Meridian Grand hadn't changed in 20 years. Same vaulted ceiling, same chandeliers that threw fractured light across the faces of men who'd ordered other men killed and then gone home to eat dinner with their families. Same thick carpet that swallowed footsteps whole, that absorbed 100 whispered conversations about money and territory and who owed what to whom. Vanessa Holloway Moretti knew this room the way she knew her own reflection, intimately and with a certain exhausted clarity. She stood near the East Bar with a glass of Barolo she hadn't touched, wearing a deep burgundy gown that Damien's assistant had sent to her dressing room that afternoon with a note that said, "Wear this and nothing else. No, please, no love, just an order dressed up as clothing." She'd put it on anyway, because 12 years of marriage had trained her body to comply even when her mind had long since stopped agreeing. The Moretti Gala was the crown jewel of Chicago's underworld social calendar. Twice a year, Damien opened the doors of the Meridian Grand to every power player in the syndicate. The Belantes from the South Side, the Drexler crew out of Cicero, the Karev family who ran the docks and never spoke above a murmur, independent operators who traded in everything from counterfeit pharmaceuticals to offshore laundering. They all came because when Damien Moretti extended an invitation, declining it was a language nobody in this city had ever successfully spoken. And Vanessa had organized every single one of these events. 12 galas in 12 years. She'd negotiated the room blocks with hotel management, coordinated the security rotations with Damien's head of protection, arranged the seating chart so that the Belantes were never within eyeline of the Korevs, and ensured that the right bottles of the right wine appeared at the right tables at the right moments. She knew which men needed to feel respected before they do business, and which men needed to feel feared. She knew which wives were worth cultivating as allies, and which ones reported back to their husbands, every word spoken in their presence. She knew all of this because she had learned it, quietly and systematically, in the years before Damien ever thought to ask. None of it had her name on it. That was the arrangement. She checked her watch, a slim Cartier on her left wrist, the only piece of jewelry she'd chosen herself tonight, and confirmed what she already knew. Damien was 12 minutes late to his own event. His guests were doing what guests do when the host is absent, drinking too quickly, clustering into uneasy configurations, manufacturing conversation to fill the space where confidence should be. Vanessa set her wine glass on the bar and turned to find Marco Teddy at her elbow. "He's pulling up now," Marco said. Marco was Damien's chief of staff, which in syndicate terms meant he was the man who handled the things Damien didn't want to think about. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, built like a side-by-side refrigerator, and possessed of a face that communicated nothing unless he decided it should. He'd worked for Damien since before Vanessa entered the picture. He was not her ally. He was not her enemy. He occupied a more difficult position than either. He was someone who respected her competence and resented her for it at the same time. "Good," Vanessa said. "The Belantes are on their second round. Get the Drexler people away from the north entrance before he walks through. They're going to want his ear immediately, and tonight's not the night." Already handled. And the flower arrangement at table 7 needs to come down 6 inches. Right now, Sal Korev can't see the person across from him without looking through a wall of white roses. Marco looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read, and then he turned and moved away without another word. That was their relationship. She gave him information. He used it. Neither of them acknowledged the nature of what was happening. The room shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle reorientation of bodies and attention, and Vanessa felt it before she saw it. She turned toward the main entrance. Damien Moretti walked in at 9:14 p.m. He was, by any objective measure, a physically impressive man. 6'2", broad through the shoulders, with the kind of dark hair that had gone distinguished rather than old at the temples. He wore a black tuxedo that had been cut for him specifically, and he moved through the ballroom with the loose, unhurried confidence of a man who had never in his adult life been required to wait for anything. Faces turned toward him, conversations paused. The air pressure in the room seemed to adjust. Vanessa had spent 12 years watching people react to her husband's presence, and she had long since stopped finding it impressive. She knew what it cost. She knew who paid for it. She began to move toward him. Her standard positioning at these events was at his left side, one step behind, close enough for him to lean and speak privately without being observed doing so. And then she stopped, because there was a woman on his arm, not in the way that arms are sometimes touched at social events, a polite escort, a gesture of courtesy. This was a different arrangement entirely. The woman was pressed against Damien's side with the practiced ease of someone who had been there before, and Damien's hand was at the small of her back in a way that announced rather than suggested. He was not trying to be subtle. He was not even trying to be careful. The woman was Celeste Vaughn. Vanessa knew the name. She had known the name for 7 months because she was not a stupid woman, and she had not survived 12 years in this world by being the kind of person who missed things. Celeste Vaughn was 31 years old, a former model turned interior designer who had redecorated 2 of Damien's hotel properties 18 months ago and apparently kept the key when she was done. She was tall, blonde, in that expensive, deliberate way, and she wore a silver gown that was cut to communicate exactly one thing to the room. What Vanessa had not known, what she was learning right now, in real time, in a ballroom full of 200 people who knew her face and her name, was that Damien had decided to stop pretending. She stood completely still. Around her, the social machine of the event kept turning. Glasses were lifted and set down. Men clasped hands and bent their heads together. A string quartet in the corner played something Vanessa couldn't hear over the blood moving through her ears. She watched Damien guide Celeste Vaughn through the room. She watched him stop at the Belanti table, where she had placed the Belantis at the best positioned table in the room, a decision she had made specifically to smooth the relationship after a territorial dispute 4 months ago, and she watched him introduce Celeste to Frank Belanti and his wife with a smile she recognized. It was the smile he used when he wanted someone to feel chosen. He had never introduced Vanessa to Frank Belanti. In 12 years of galas, she had introduced herself. She became aware slowly that people were looking at her. Not at Damien, at her. The wives especially, and a handful of the men who paid attention to social dynamics because their survival depended on it. They were watching to see what she would do with her face. Vanessa did what she had trained herself to do. She smoothed every muscle from her jaw to her brow, and she picked up her wine glass, and she took a small, measured sip. Inside, something she had been telling herself wasn't real for 7 months, finished breaking apart. Ugh. She found Marcus Webb near the dessert table. Marcus was the Moretti family's legal architect, the attorney who structured the shell corporations and the offshore vehicles and the acquisition strategies that transformed syndicate money into legitimate holdings. He was 62, rumpled in the way that certain brilliant men are permanently rumpled, and he had worked for the Moretti organization for 23 years. He was not loyal to Damien in the way Marco Teti was loyal. He was loyal to the enterprise, which was a distinction that had mattered to Vanessa for a long time. "How long has he been planning this?" she asked. Marcus didn't pretend not to know what she was asking. He looked at a point somewhere past her left shoulder and said, "I wouldn't have any direct knowledge of Marcus." He looked at her then. Something moved behind his eyes. 6 weeks, he said quietly. The announcement was going to come at the end of the quarter. He stopped. "I didn't know it would be here. Tonight." "The announcement," Vanessa said. "Damien intends to position Celeste as—" Marcus stopped again, and she could see him choosing his words with the care of a man stepping through a minefield he hadn't been warned about. "As a more public presence. In his life. Going forward." Vanessa understood what he was not saying. The gala was the announcement. 200 people in this room, and every one of them would carry the image out into Chicago's underworld with perfect fidelity. By tomorrow morning, the entire syndicate ecosystem would know that Damien Moretti had brought his mistress to his own event, and positioned her in the place where his wife was supposed to stand. This was not an affair. Affairs were private. This was a statement. "What about the Verano account?" she said. Marcus blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The Verano account, the restructuring I've been managing for the past 8 months. The offshore vehicle through the Cayman subsidiary? Are the authorization signatures in order, or is there still the documentation gap I flagged in February?" He stared at her for a moment as if she'd said something in a language he was still learning. Yes, there's still the gap. I'll send you the corrected structure before the end of the week," she said. "Make sure the timestamp on the filing reflects the original intent date, not the correction date. And the Harwick property transfers. Those need to close by the 15th or we lose the tax position." "Vanessa, I'm fine, Marcus." He looked at her with the particular exhausted sadness of a man who had seen too many people damage other people and been unable to stop any of it. "I know you are," he said. She moved away from him. She kept her shoulders straight and her expression neutral, and she moved through the room with the same deliberate, unhurried ease she had watched Damien use for 12 years. And she was aware that this was something she had learned from a man who had never bothered to notice she'd learned it. She did not look at the Belanti table. She did not look at Celeste Vaughn's silver gown, or at Damien's hand at the small of Celeste's back, or at the particular way Celeste tilted her head when she spoke to powerful men. That practiced upward angle that said, "I'm listening to you specifically," and which Vanessa recognized as a technique because she had used it herself. In earlier years, before she'd understood that making men feel listened to was a faster path to influence than actually listening to them. She moved through the room, and she spoke to the people she needed to speak to, and she said the things that needed saying, and by 10:45 she had smoothed 3 potential tensions, redirected a conversation between 2 Drexler associates that had been sliding towards something territorial, and made sure that Sal Korev understood, without being told directly, that the restructuring of the port access fees was going to benefit his operation specifically. She did this because these were things that needed doing, and she was the person who knew how to do them, and she did it without expecting thanks or credit or acknowledgement of any kind, because she had stopped expecting those things from this room approximately 7 years ago. At 11:15, Damien found her near the east windows. "You look good tonight," he said. He said it easily, the way he said most things, as if words were currency he had in unlimited supply. Vanessa looked at him. She studied his face the way she had studied it at the beginning, when she was 24 years old and newly married to the most dangerous man she'd ever met and still trying to understand what she'd agreed to. He looked the same as he always had. That was the thing about Damien. He never looked like what he was. He looked like a man who had never done anything that couldn't be forgiven. "The Korev seating issue is resolved," she said. "And you need to spend 15 minutes with Frank Belanti before the end of the night. He's been patient about the West End question, but he's running out of patience, and tonight is the right moment to acknowledge that." Damien's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not toward anything she could name, just away from the easy confidence, toward something she'd seen only rarely over the years. Something that might have been, in a less controlled man, discomfort. "That's not what I wanted to talk about," he said. "I know." "Vanessa, did you choose the dress on purpose," she said, "or did your assistant just send something that happened to match her gown?" The silence between them had weight and texture. "She's important to me," Damien said. He said it carefully, with the particular caution of a man who has rehearsed a conversation and is now discovering that the rehearsal didn't cover everything. "I know that too. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought it was better to be direct. In a room with 200 people. In a room where people were going to find out anyway." Vanessa looked at him for a long moment. Outside the east windows, Chicago spread out below them in the November dark, a grid of lights that she had looked at from this same window at this same event for 12 years. She knew this city the way she knew this room. She had learned it alongside this man, and she had put pieces of herself into the learning that she was never going to get back. "When you told me this marriage was a partnership," she said, "I believed you. That was my mistake, not yours. I want you to know I understand that." He looked at her with something that might have been surprise or might have been something harder to name. I never meant, I know what you meant, and I know what you didn't. She held his eyes for one more second. Talk to Frank Belanti before midnight, and tell Marco the north exit needs an additional sweep before the room clears. I saw at least 2 people tonight who weren't on the guest list. She walked away from him. She walked through the ballroom and past the bar and through the service corridor that she knew because she had learned the floor plan of this hotel years ago for exactly this kind of contingency. And she came out on the side street where the catering trucks idled in the cold air. The door fell shut behind her, and the noise of the event dropped to a murmur, and she stood in the November dark with the exhaust from the trucks rising around her, and she breathed. She breathed. Her hands were not shaking. That surprised her in a distant way. She had expected shaking hands. Instead, they were very still, hanging at her sides. And what she felt was not the hot, collapsing grief she had expected, but something colder and more structural, like a building after an earthquake, when the dust has cleared and you can finally see which walls are still standing. She stood there for 4 minutes. She counted them. Then she went back inside and retrieved her coat and her bag from the cloakroom, and she said goodnight to the coat check attendant by name. His name was Derek. He was working his way through DePaul's accounting program, and she knew this because she asked questions of people that other people in this world did not bother to ask. And she walked out the front entrance of the Meridian Grand and got into the car that was waiting for her and told the driver to take her home. In the car, she did not cry. She looked out at the city and she thought about the Verano account and the Harwick property transfers and the 17 other active financial structures she had been quietly managing for the past 3 years. And she thought about what it meant that she knew where all the money was and where all the bodies were buried and what the corrected structure of the offshore vehicle through the Cayman subsidiary needed to look like. And she thought about the fact that Damien Moretti had never once, in 12 years of marriage, asked her to explain how any of it worked. He had trusted her with everything and taken credit for all of it, and she had let him, and that had been her mistake. Not loving him, not marrying him, not even staying. The mistake was believing that invisibility was the same thing as safety. Well, the house was in Lincoln Park, a limestone townhouse 4 stories tall that she had furnished and maintained for 11 years. She moved through it in the dark without turning on lights because she knew every room by memory, every threshold and stair, every place where the floor had a particular sound underfoot. She went to the study on the 3rd floor. The study was the one room in the house that Damien never used. He had his office at the Meridian building downtown and the den on the 2nd floor where he watched football and took calls. But the study had always been hers in practice, if not in designation. The bookshelves held her books. The desk held her work. The filing cabinet in the corner held 11 years of documentation she had been building with the quiet, systematic patience of a person who had known, somewhere below the level of conscious acknowledgement, that she might eventually need it. She sat down at the desk. She opened the bottom drawer and removed a leather portfolio that Damien had never seen. Inside it were 12 months of financial records in a format she had developed herself, cross-referenced against the official records in ways that would take anyone without her specific knowledge approximately 6 months to untangle. They were not copies of the criminal documentation. She was not building a case. She had never been building a case. She did not work that way. What she had been building was a map, a complete verified map of every decision, every structure, every relationship in the Moretti financial ecosystem, annotated in her own handwriting in a code that was not particularly difficult to read if you knew the underlying logic, and that was completely opaque if you didn't. She sat at the desk, and she opened the portfolio, and she looked at what 12 years of invisible work looked like when you laid it out in front of you. Then she closed it and put it back in the drawer, and she went to the kitchen and she made herself a cup of tea, and she sat at the kitchen table and she thought carefully about what she was going to do next. She thought about it for a long time. Then, 3 days later, she was gone. Not dramatically, not in the middle of the night with packed bags and a one-way ticket. She was not a dramatic woman, and drama attracted attention, and attention was the one thing she could not afford. Instead, she did it the way she had learned to do everything that mattered, quietly, systematically, over a period of weeks that had begun before the gala. If she was honest about it, because she had understood at some level that the gala was coming, even if she hadn't known what form it would take. She had been methodical. She had opened accounts in a name that was not her married name, using documentation she had acquired through channels she had learned about in the years when Damien was teaching her how this world worked. She had transferred certain assets through a series of structures that were legally hers to transfer. Her own inheritance from her father, the proceeds of investments she had made in her own name during years when Damien was cash poor, and she was not. And she had done so in amounts and through vehicles that would not attract immediate scrutiny. She had leased an apartment in a building in Wicker Park under the new name. She had purchased a used car with cash. She had terminated, quietly, the standing obligations she had to the Moretti household, the vendors, the service providers, the institutional relationships, in ways that would take Marco Teddy 2 to 3 weeks to fully map before he understood what was missing. She did not take the portfolio. She memorized what she needed from it and left it in the drawer and walked away from it. Paper was evidence. Her memory was not. She did not leave a note. She did not send a message. She did not make a phone call to anyone in Damien's world. She packed 2 suitcases with the things that were actually hers, not the wardrobe that had been assembled to make Damien's wife look appropriate for Damien's events, but the clothes she had bought for herself in the years before she understood the distinction between those 2 categories. She took her books. She took the small photograph of her mother that lived in the nightstand drawer. She took the Cartier watch. She left the rings on the kitchen counter. Not dramatically. She didn't place them in the center of the counter or position them to be found. She just set them down on the edge, near the fruit bowl, where they would be noticed in the ordinary course of someone moving through the kitchen, and then she picked up her 2 suitcases and she walked out the front door of the Lincoln Park townhouse for the last time, and she did not look back at it. The November air was very cold. Her breath made brief shapes in it that disappeared immediately. She put the suitcases in the trunk of the used car, and she drove west and then north, and she did not cry until she was on the highway, and when she cried, it was not for long, and it was not the kind of crying that breaks you open. It was the kind that happens when a pressure that has been building for a long time finally finds an exit. She let it run its course, and then she wiped her face, and she kept driving. She had not asked for revenge. She had not planned revenge. She understood what revenge cost and what it left you with, because she had lived inside a world that ran on revenge for 12 years, and she had seen what it did to the men who organized their lives around it. They did not become powerful through revenge. They became smaller. They became defined by the thing they couldn't let go of, and eventually the thing consumed them from the inside until there was nothing left but the grievance wearing a man-shaped suit. She did not want that. What she wanted, and she thought about it clearly, for the first time in years, as the highway stretched north ahead of her and the Chicago skyline receded in her rearview mirror, was to find out what she was when she wasn't someone's invisible architecture. She had given 12 years of herself to a man who had never asked her name for it. She had built something extraordinary out of intelligence and patience and the willingness to work in the dark, and she had done it so thoroughly that the work and the man had become synonymous in the eyes of everyone who benefited from it. Damien Moretti's empire, Damien Moretti's brilliance, Damien Moretti's reputation for running the cleanest, most financially sophisticated criminal organization in the Midwest. Her work. His name. She drove. She thought about what it would mean to build something for herself. Not for a man, not for a household, not as an invisible component in someone else's machine, but for herself, in her own name, in ways that she could stand in front of and say, "I did this." She did not know yet what form it would take. She only knew that she had the knowledge, and she had the skill, and she had been invisible long enough that disappearing now would not require any particular effort. She had been practicing it her whole adult life. The car moved through the dark, and 3 miles behind her, in the limestone townhouse in Lincoln Park, Damien Moretti was arriving home to find his wife gone, and 2 rings on the kitchen counter, and no note. She had been in the Wicker Park apartment for 11 days when the first sign appeared that she had been right to move quickly. She was sitting at a second-hand desk she'd bought from a resale shop on Milwaukee Avenue, working through a legal structure she was building from scratch for a consulting operation she hadn't yet named, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She let it go. It buzzed again 20 minutes later. Same number. She let it go again. On the third call, something made her answer. Vanessa Holloway. The voice was male, even, and completely unfamiliar. Not a voice from Damien's world. She knew all of those voices. This was something else. Who is this? My name is Daniel Reeves, the man said. I'm calling on behalf of a client who would very much like to meet you. You have the wrong number. I don't think so. A brief pause. The client is aware that you left the Moretti household 11 days ago. The client is also aware that you have certain organizational knowledge that... She ended the call. She sat very still at the second-hand desk with the phone face down in front of her, and she thought about what had just happened. 11 days. It had taken 11 days for someone outside Damien's organization to locate her. That was faster than she had expected. Not dangerously fast, but fast enough to clarify that her new identity was not as complete as she needed it to be, and that the world she had left had a longer reach than she had accounted for. She thought about the name on the call. Daniel Reeves, the client who had not been named. The client who knew she had left the Moretti household and who characterized her knowledge as organizational. She thought about who, in Chicago, would have both the intelligence capacity to locate her in 11 days and the strategic interest in what she knew about Damien Moretti's operation. The list was not long. She picked up the phone. She called the number back. Tell your client, she said when Reeves answered, that I'm not interested in anything that requires me to operate inside someone else's structure again. A silence. Then, the client anticipated that position. The client asked me to convey that the structure being proposed is not that kind of arrangement. What kind of arrangement is it? That's a conversation that would need to happen in person. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Wicker Park street was doing what Chicago streets did in late November. Gray sky, dead leaves plastered flat against the wet pavement, the particular smell of a city settling into winter. She had spent 12 years insulated from streets like this by the thickness of Damien's world. Now she was in it, the cold coming through the apartment's inadequate windows, the radiator ticking with a sound like something small and persistent working its way out of a trap. One meeting, she said, in a location I choose, and if I don't like what I hear in the first 5 minutes, I walk. Understood, Reeves said. I'll text this number with a time and place. She hung up. She sat for a long moment with her hands flat on the desk, feeling the grain of the second-hand wood under her palms, thinking about what she had just agreed to and what it might mean, and whether she was making the same mistake she'd made at 24, or whether she had, in 12 years of invisible apprenticeship, learned enough to know the difference. She didn't know yet, but she had spent 12 years making decisions in the dark on behalf of a man who never asked how she'd made them, and she had been right far more often than she had been wrong, and the person who'd been calling those shots, the actual intelligence behind Damien Moretti's empire, was sitting in this apartment right now with 2 suitcases and a second-hand desk and a very clear understanding of what she was worth. Whatever came next, she was going to find out. She picked up her phone and she began composing a message, and the radiator kept ticking, and outside, Chicago moved through its gray November afternoon completely indifferent to the fact that something had just begun. The cafe was called Lena's, and it was the kind of place that existed in the margins of neighborhoods like Wicker Park, a narrow room with mismatched chairs and a counter that hadn't been refinished since the 90s, run by a woman named Lena who was in her 70s and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had long since stopped doing anything that wasn't necessary. The coffee was good, the sightlines were better. Vanessa had chosen it for both reasons. She arrived 20 minutes early and sat with her back to the wall in a clear view of the door and a cup of black coffee she wasn't drinking. She watched the street through the window. She watched the door. She noted the man in the gray coat who walked past twice without coming in. Not surveillance, just someone waiting for a bus. She confirmed when she saw him board the 72. And she noted the couple at the corner table who were too absorbed in each other to be anything but what they appeared to be. At exactly 11 o'clock, Daniel Reeves walked in. He was younger than his voice had suggested. Mid-30s, lean, wearing a coat that was good without being conspicuous. He had the kind of eyes that moved across a room and cataloged it in the first 3 seconds, and he didn't pretend not to be doing it. She appreciated that. Men who pretended not to be assessing you were always more dangerous than men who just did it openly. He sat down across from her without being invited. "You came alone," she said. "My client felt a larger presence would send the wrong message." "Who is your client?" Reeves placed his hands flat on the table. Clean hands, no rings. Adrian Cross. She had known it was going to be that name. She had known it the moment she'd thought through the list of people with the capacity and the motivation, and she had let herself be slightly wrong in her preparation anyway, because allowing herself to be slightly wrong kept her honest. Adrian Cross. She had never met the man. She knew him the way she knew everything in Damien's world, through the negative space he occupied in Damien's conversations, through the things Damien said about him when he was angry, and the more telling things he didn't say when he was trying to be calm. Adrian Cross ran the Cross organization out of the near North Side, and he had been Damien Moretti's primary rival for territory and influence for at least 8 years. The two organizations had maintained a cold, functional non-aggression through a combination of mutual deterrence and the understanding that open conflict would cost both sides more than the disputed ground was worth. It was not peace, it was the absence of war, which was a different thing entirely. "Why?" she said. Reeves tilted his head slightly. He'd prefer to answer that himself. "I'm asking you." A beat. "Mr. Cross believes your departure from the Moretti household represents a significant shift in the operational landscape. He's interested in understanding the nature of that shift. He wants to know what I know about Damien's operation. He wants to offer you an opportunity that is commensurate with your actual capabilities." Reeves held her eyes. "Those are different things." "They don't sound different." "They are. The first is a transaction. The second is an ongoing arrangement with a seat at the table, not under it." Vanessa looked at him for a long moment. The cafe moved around them. The bell over the door, Lena behind the counter with the studied indifference of a woman who had hosted 1,000 conversations she knew better than to listen to. The coffee had gone cold in the cup. "I'll meet with him," Vanessa said. "Once. Same terms as this." Reeves nodded and stood. "Tomorrow evening. I'll send you an address." "Send it 2 hours before." "Not before." He looked at her with something that was almost the beginning of a smile. "Understood," he said, and he left. She spent the rest of that day and all of the following morning doing what she always did when she needed to think clearly. She worked. She sat at the second-hand desk, and she built out the legal structure for her consulting operation with the methodical focus of someone for whom work had always been the most reliable form of control. Not because the work distracted her from thinking, but because it organized her thinking, gave it shape, forced the scattered reactive noise of emotion into the structured channels where she could actually use it. She thought about Adrian Cross. She thought about what she knew and what she didn't know, and how much of what she knew was Damien's version of the truth, which was a category of information she had learned to treat with significant skepticism. Damien's version of any truth had been filtered through Damien's ego and Damien's strategic interests before it reached her, and she had learned to account for that distortion in everything he told her, the way you account for the bend of light through water when you're trying to hit a target beneath the surface. What she knew independent of Damien's account. The Cross organization was older and in some ways more sophisticated than the Moretti operation. It had deeper roots in the legitimate economy, real estate, private security, a portfolio of hospitality assets on the near North Side that had been generating clean revenue for over a decade. It was smaller in terms of raw personnel, but significantly less exposed, which in the current regulatory environment was worth more than size. It had survived 3 federal investigations in 10 years without a single conviction, which was either exceptional legal defense or exceptional operational discipline. And from what she knew of Adrian Cross, it was probably both. What she did not know: the man himself. Everything she had on Adrian Cross was structural and financial and secondhand. She did not know what kind of intelligence she was walking into tomorrow, and that gap bothered her in the particular way that unfillable information gaps always bothered her, like a tooth that wasn't there anymore, the tongue finding the absence over and over. She worked until 2 in the morning. Then she made herself stop and she went to bed, and she lay in the dark of the Wicker Park apartment listening to the radiator and the street noise, and she thought about the rings she'd left on the kitchen counter in Lincoln Park, and whether Damien had found them himself or whether Marco had found them first, and what Marco's face had looked like when he'd understood what he was looking at. She slept eventually. Not well, but enough. The address arrived at 6:47 p.m. A building in River North she didn't recognize by the number, but which she identified immediately when she mapped it. A converted warehouse that had been in the Cross portfolio for 6 years, operating on its public-facing side as an event space and private dining facility. Clean money wrapped around whatever it needed to wrap around. Efficient. She arrived at 8:50. The building's public entrance was dark. No event tonight. But there was a side door with a light above it and a man standing outside who did not look like a doorman, and who opened the door for her without speaking and pointed her toward the elevator. The elevator opened into a room on the 4th floor that did not look like a criminal's workspace. It looked like the office of someone who thought carefully about where they chose to spend their hours. Bookshelves that were clearly used rather than decorative, a long work table covered in documents that had been organized rather than stacked, a window along the north wall that looked out over the city with the kind of unobstructed view that cost money, and at the far end of the table, a man who stood when she walked in. Adrian Cross was not what she'd expected, which she acknowledged to herself as a failure of imagination on her part. She had built a picture of him from Damien's hatred and the structural facts of his organization, and the picture had been a composite of those inputs rather than a person. The person was somewhere in his mid-40s, slightly under 6 feet, with a stillness about him that was not passivity, but something more like conserved energy. The quality of someone who moved only when movement was warranted and had learned through long practice to tell the difference. His face was sharp at the jaw and quieter at the eyes than she'd expected. He looked like a man who slept adequately and ate regular meals, which in this world was its own kind of discipline. "Mrs. Moretti," he said. "Holloway," she said. "I'm using my own name." Something shifted at the corners of his eyes. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. "Miss Holloway, thank you for coming." She sat down without being offered a seat, across the table from him, and she put her bag on the table in front of her because she wanted her hands free, and she wanted him to see that she'd made that choice deliberately. "You found me in 11 days, she said. 8, actually. We waited 3 days before making contact. Why? Because calling someone 8 days after they've left a 12-year marriage felt premature. He said it without apparent irony. "Please, you want to know why I asked for this meeting?" "I know why you asked for this meeting. I want to know what you're actually offering." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not assessment exactly. He'd done that already, she could tell, in the first 30 seconds. Something more like recalibration. "The Moretti organization is going to experience significant structural instability in the next 6 months," he said, "independent of anything we do. It's a consequence of decisions Damien has been making for the past 2 years. Overextension in 3 territories, an alliance with the Drexler crew that has a fundamental trust problem at its center, and a financial architecture that is considerably more fragile than it appears from outside." He paused. "You know all of this." "I know some of it." "You know most of it. Probably more than I do." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm not asking you to tell me what you know. I want to be clear about that. I'm not interested in using what you know against Damien directly. That's not how I run this organization. And it would also be tactically short-sighted because whatever leverage comes from inside knowledge has a half-life, and I'm not interested in half-life assets." Vanessa looked at him. "Then what are you interested in?" "I want to restructure the financial arm of this organization," he said. "Legitimately. Not as a cover, as an actual transformation. The kind that takes this organization out of the territory wars and into a position where we're generating sustainable revenue through legal vehicles that can survive scrutiny." He held her eyes. "I've been trying to do this for 4 years. I don't have the right person to build the structure." "You think I'm that person?" "I've looked at the Moretti financial architecture for 3 years. Every sophisticated element of it traces back to decisions that Damien Moretti doesn't have the intellectual framework to have made. He's not unintelligent, but he thinks in terms of power and force. The person who built the offshore vehicle through the Cayman subsidiary, the Harwick property chain, the Verano account restructuring, That person thinks in terms of systems. He paused. I want to hire that person. The room was very quiet. Outside the north window, the city turned its lights on against the early dark. Vanessa thought about what he was offering. She thought about it the way she thought about financial structures. Not emotionally, not reactively, but with the part of her mind that could hold multiple variables simultaneously and map the relationship between them. She thought about what it meant that he had specifically named the Verano account, which meant his intelligence on the Moretti organization was better than she had estimated, and what it meant that he was framing this as a hiring rather than a transaction, and what it meant that he had waited 3 days before contacting her. I'm not coming in under anyone, she said. Not again. If I build the structure, I control the structure. Full authority over financial architecture and strategy. No decisions that affect the financial position get made without my sign-off. Agreed. She hadn't expected him to agree immediately. She'd expected negotiation, some counter-positioning, the standard male reflex of qualifying the concession before granting it. His immediate agreement threw her slightly, and she was aware that it did, and she filed that awareness carefully. I want 3 months before any formal arrangement is established, she said. I'm not walking into another situation blind. Also agreed. He paused. I'd suggest we use those 3 months as a trial. You take one project, something contained, defined scope. We see how we work. What project? He reached to his right and slid a folder across the table toward her. She opened it. Inside were 6 pages of financial documentation, the bones of a real estate acquisition structure that was functional but inelegant, with 3 specific vulnerabilities she identified inside 45 seconds of looking at it. The Harbor Point acquisition, he said. We've been trying to close it for 8 months. There's a structural problem somewhere that my people can't locate. She looked at the documents. She looked at page 3, where the vulnerability she'd spotted in the first pass resolved itself into something specific and correctable. She looked at page 5, where the second vulnerability was buried in a footnote that someone hadn't understood was a footnote. She looked at page 6, where the third vulnerability was actually not a vulnerability at all, but a feature that whoever had built this structure hadn't recognized as such. 6 weeks, she said. I can close this in 6 weeks. Adrian Cross looked at her across the table in the River North warehouse with the city moving in the dark behind him, and for the first time since she'd walked into this room, something shifted in his expression into something she could actually read. Not satisfaction, something quieter and more considered than that. The look of a man who has been searching for a specific thing for a long time and has just found it and is being careful not to show how much that matters. 6 weeks, he said. Months. She closed the Harbor Point acquisition in 38 days. The structural problem had been what she'd suspected from the folder, a cascading error in the ownership chain that created an inadvertent tax exposure on the back end of the deal, compounded by a documentation gap on the second entity in the chain that would have triggered a regulatory review if the acquisition had proceeded as structured. She rebuilt the chain from the third entity forward, corrected the documentation gap through a filing. She routed through a different jurisdiction entirely, and restructured the back-end position so that the tax exposure not only disappeared but inverted into a modest advantage. She did this from the Wicker Park apartment through Marcus Webb, who had called her 3 weeks after she'd left Lincoln Park, not on behalf of Damien, but on his own behalf, because Marcus Webb was 62 years old and had been watching the Moretti organization from inside for 23 years and understood with a clarity that came from long observation that the thing holding it together was no longer there, and through 2 other attorneys she trusted from previous work. She did not set foot in any cross-organization facility. She did not take a call from Adrian Cross directly. She communicated through Reeves and through documentation, and she built the corrected structure with the same invisible precision she had spent 12 years developing. And at the end of 38 days, she sent a 14-page memo to Reeves outlining what she'd done, why she'd done it, and what the organization's financial position looked like now versus what it had looked like before. 2 days later, Adrian Cross called her directly. The memo, he said. Yes. The section on the regulatory environment, the projection for the next 18 months. Walk me through the assumptions. She walked him through the assumptions. It took 40 minutes. He asked 11 questions. 10 of them were exactly the right questions to ask, and one of them was a question she hadn't anticipated, which meant he was seeing something she needed to look at again. She told him that. He said he thought so too. "I want to start the longer conversation," he said, "about the full restructuring." "I'm ready for that conversation," she said. They met twice a week for the next month. In the River North building, across the long work table, with documents spread between them and coffee that was actually good, he had a machine that she eventually identified as Italian and clearly expensive, which she noted as one of the first personal details she'd accumulated about him that wasn't professional. He cared about coffee. He kept the books on his shelves in categories she needed. 3 visits to decode. Not by subject, not alphabetically, but by some internal logic that turned out, when she asked him about it on the 4th meeting, to be chronological by the order in which he'd read them. He had read them all. She did not think about any of this in the way she might have thought about it in another life. She thought about it the way she thought about relevant data, as information that helped her understand the intelligence she was working alongside. That was what she told herself. The news about the Moretti organization came to her in fragments. The first fragment arrived through Marcus Webb, who called her in the 4th week of December to tell her that the alliance with the Drexler crew had fractured. She had expected this. The trust problem at the center of that alliance had been visible to her for 2 years, a slow leak that Damien had never wanted to acknowledge because the Drexler connection gave him access to the port infrastructure he needed for the pharmaceutical operation on the south side. Without Drexler, that operation was exposed. Without that operation, approximately 30% of the Moretti organization's monthly revenue stream disappeared. "How is he handling it?" she said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Badly," he said, and the word carried the specific weight of understatement. The second fragment arrived 3 days later through a source she had cultivated independently, a woman named Tina Park, who worked in corporate compliance at a mid-sized accounting firm that had audited 2 of Damien's legitimate business holdings. Tina was not a criminal and had no criminal connections. She was simply a person who paid attention to things and who had, over the course of several years, developed an understanding with Vanessa that was mutually beneficial and professionally deniable. Tina called to say that one of the legitimate holdings, a restaurant group on the north side, had received a notice of audit from the IRS routine in isolation. Not routine given the timing. The Moretti Empire was beginning to show its load-bearing walls. The third fragment was not a fragment. It arrived on a Thursday morning in the form of a headline on a Chicago Tribune news alert that Vanessa read on her phone at the second-hand desk while her coffee went cold beside her. Celeste Vaughn, lifestyle entrepreneur and designer, announces partnership with federal investigators in ongoing investigation into Chicago organized crime. Vanessa read the article twice. She read it the way she read financial documents, not for the surface information, but for the architecture underneath. Celeste Vaughn had been talking to federal investigators for 4 months, according to the article's careful non-attribution. She had provided documentation. The nature of the documentation was not specified, but the article used the phrase financial records twice and organizational communications once, which told Vanessa everything she needed to know about what Celeste had actually been selling and to whom. She sat with the phone in her hands and thought about Celeste Vaughn pressing close to Damien's side in the Meridian Grand Ballroom, and the practiced tilt of her head when she spoke to powerful men. And she thought about what that meant. Not the betrayal, which Vanessa had seen coming the moment she'd understood who Celeste was, but the particular quality of the betrayal. Celeste had not panicked and run. She had not made an emotional decision. She had been building her exit strategy from inside the relationship with the patients and the method of someone who understood that the value of the information had to be maximized before it was liquidated. Vanessa found, to her own faint surprise, that she had a certain cold professional respect for it. Then she thought about what it meant for Damien. She called Adrian Cross. He answered on the second ring. "I saw it," he said, before she could speak. "He's going to come apart fast now. The federal attention combined with the Drexler fracture and the IRS notice on the restaurant group, he doesn't have the financial infrastructure to survive all three simultaneously. No, Adrian agreed. There was a pause. Are you all right? The question landed unexpectedly. She sat with it for a moment. Outside, the December street was gray and flat, and a delivery truck was double parked in front of the building across the way, its hazard lights blinking with metronomic indifference. I'm fine, she said. And then, because he had asked the question without the usual male subtext of asking it, without the implication that her being fine or not fine was something that reflected on him or that required management, she said, It's strange, watching something fall apart that you spent years building. Yes, he said. Just that. Not a consolation, not a redirection. Just the acknowledgement of a man who had also built things and understood what it cost. She gripped the phone and looked at the gray December street and thought about the person she had been 11 years ago, sitting in that Lincoln Park townhouse, learning how to make an empire run while convincing herself that invisibility was a reasonable price to pay for security. We need to accelerate the restructuring timeline, she said. If the Moretti situation draws federal attention to the broader Chicago landscape, we want the cross-organization as clean as possible before that happens. I agree. How much can you accelerate? Significantly. I've been conservative in the projections to build in a margin. If I remove the margin and push the filing timelines, I can have the primary structure complete in 10 weeks instead of 16. What do you need from me to make that happen? Full access to the Harwick equivalent documentation on your side, and a direct line to your outside counsel. I've been routing through Reeves, and it's adding lag I can't afford if we're compressing the timeline. Done. I'll have both arranged today. Another pause, shorter this time. Vanessa. She noticed, without meaning to, that he'd used her name. In 6 weeks of working together, he had called her Ms. Holloway in every meeting and every call, and she had not thought about it consciously, but she noticed its absence now, the way you notice the radiator only when it stops making noise. The restructuring, he said carefully. If we do this the right way, if it works, I want you to have a formal role, not as a consultant, as a partner. Your name on the structure you build. The December light came through the window at a low angle and put a stripe of pale gold across the surface of the second-hand desk. She looked at it. She thought about 12 years of work with no name on any of it. She thought about what it would mean to build something and be able to stand in front of it. Let's get the 10 weeks done first, she said. Of course, he said. She ended the call and set the phone down on the desk and put both hands flat on the surface the way she sometimes did when she needed to feel something solid. And she stayed like that for a moment, breathing. Then she pulled the Harbor Point documentation toward her, and she went back to work. She was 3 weeks into the accelerated timeline when Marco Teti showed up at her door. She opened it because the building's intercom camera had shown her his face, and she opened it because she had expected him before now, and his arriving meant that the situation with Damien had reached a specific threshold, and she needed to know what that threshold was. Marco looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He was still built like a refrigerator, but something in the structural confidence of him had gone off true, like a wall that shifted slightly at the foundation. He stood in her doorway with the cold of the hallway coming in around him, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It looked, she thought, almost like something he needed from her. He wants to see you, Marco said. I know. Vanessa. He stopped. He pressed his lips together and looked at the floor of the hallway for a moment and then looked back at her. It's bad. I want you to understand. It's bad in a way that I don't know how to fix. I know that too, Marco. He needs... What Damien needs, she said carefully, is not something I can give him. It's not something I'm willing to try to give him. I want you to hear that clearly so there's no miscommunication when you go back. Marco looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly. You knew, he said. You knew it was all going to come apart. I knew it was structurally fragile. I told him that 3 years ago, and again 2 years ago, and again 18 months ago. She held his eyes. He didn't want to hear it. He doesn't... Marco stopped again. Something passed across his face that was uncomfortable to look at. Not grief exactly, but the specific discomfort of a loyal man confronting the possibility that the thing he's been loyal to was not worthy of it. He doesn't understand how much of it was you, even now. He keeps saying he'll rebuild. He keeps talking about the restructuring as if it's just a matter of... He shook his head. He doesn't see it. No, Vanessa said. You're not going to come back. No. Marco looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded, a single slow movement, and he turned and walked back toward the elevator. She watched him go. She watched the elevator doors open and swallow him and close behind him. She closed her apartment door and stood with her back against it in the narrow hallway, in the quiet of the Wicker Park apartment with the radiator ticking and the December cold pressing through the windows. And she understood that something had just become irrevocable. Not the leaving. The leaving had been irrevocable from the moment she'd set those rings on the kitchen counter. But something else. The last thread of the possibility that this was temporary, that the world she'd left was still somehow available to return to. It wasn't. It was coming apart. She was watching it come apart from the outside, and she was not going back in, and the person who understood better than anyone what that world had been worth was now building something new with the intelligence she'd developed inside it, and Damien Moretti was going to have to find out what his empire looked like when the invisible architecture walked away. She pushed off the door. She walked to the desk. She sat down. On her laptop, a new email from Reeves sat in the inbox. Adrian's outside counsel, ready to connect, with the documentation access she had requested. She opened it. And 3 miles south, in the ruins of what had once been the most powerful criminal organization in the city, Damien Moretti picked up his phone and made a call that Celeste Vaughn did not answer because Celeste Vaughn was sitting in a federal building downtown, and the agents across the table from her had just asked her to describe, in as much detail as she could recall, the structure of the Moretti offshore accounts through the Cayman subsidiary, the account that Vanessa had built and that Celeste had been photographing on Damien's laptop for 4 months, and that she had just finished explaining to 3 federal agents who were now looking at each other with the particular expression of people who have just realized they are looking at something much larger than what they came in expecting to find. The federal building on Dearborn Street was a place Vanessa had driven past 100 times without ever looking at directly. One of those institutional structures that exists at the periphery of awareness for people who have spent their adult lives in proximity to the kinds of activities that federal buildings exist to investigate. She had trained herself not to look at it. Not out of guilt, but out of the same professional discipline that kept you from looking at the camera in a room where you weren't supposed to know there was a camera. She was looking at it now. She was looking at it from the passenger seat of Adrian's car. A dark gray sedan that was neither conspicuous nor cheap, like most things Adrian chose, parked on the opposite side of Dearborn with the engine off and the heat running because the December cold had teeth in it today, real teeth, the kind that came off Lake Michigan with nothing to stop it. It was 9:40 in the morning. She had been awake since 4. Adrian had called her at 6 a.m., not Reeves. Adrian directly, which in 7 weeks of working together had happened exactly twice before, and both times it had meant something that required immediate attention. "There's a problem," he'd said, and the particular flatness in his voice told her the problem was specific and serious. The problem was this. The federal investigation that Celeste Vaughn had seeded was not limited to the Moretti organization. It had expanded. The expansion had a name. Special Agent Karen Holt, who ran the organized crime unit out of the Chicago field office and who had, according to Adrian's source inside the federal building, spent the last 72 hours building a map that extended well beyond Damien Moretti's collapsing empire. The map included the Cross organization. It included several of the financial structures that Vanessa had built over the past 8 weeks. And it included, in a section that Adrian's source had described with the specific uncomfortable care of someone delivering news they knew would land badly, a file with Vanessa's name on it. Not Moretti. Not the married name. Holloway. Her name. She sat in the passenger seat of Adrian's car and looked at the federal building and breathed carefully through her nose. "The Cayman structure," she said. "Yes." Celeste photographed more than the current documentation. She photographed the build history. That's what the source indicated. Vanessa pressed her fingertips against her thigh and thought about the Cayman subsidiary account and the 14 months it had taken her to build it correctly, and the documentation trail that existed inside that build history. The intermediate structures, the correction filings, the annotated memos she had written for her own reference because she thought in writing and always had. She thought about what that documentation trail showed about who had made the decisions and who had done the technical construction of the structure. It showed her, clearly and completely, and with her own handwriting on half of it. She had built it to be attributable to the Moretti organization, not to herself personally. She had been careful about that, deliberate, because she had always understood that her own exposure needed to be managed, but the build history was different from the final structure. The build history showed the thinking, and the thinking was unmistakably hers. "How long do I have?" she said. "The source thinks Holt is 2 weeks from a filing, maybe 3 if we're fortunate with the timeline." Adrian's hands were on the steering wheel even though the car wasn't moving. She had noticed that about him. He grounded himself physically when he was working through something serious. "There are options," he said carefully. "Tell me the options." "The first option is a voluntary approach. You contact Holt's office directly, through counsel, before the filing. You frame the engagement as cooperation. In exchange for what you provide on the Moretti operation, you negotiate a specific immunity posture that excludes your role in the financial architecture. That works if what I provide is worth more than what they already have. If Celeste has given them the build history, they may already have most of the Moretti picture. The marginal value of my cooperation goes down significantly." "Yes." The second option. The second option is structural. We accelerate the legitimization of the cross-financial architecture beyond the 10-week timeline, compress it to 4 weeks, file the documentation, establish the clean posture before Holt moves. Your association with the cross-organization is then characterized as the commencement of a legitimate consulting arrangement rather than a continuation of criminal financial work. That works if the 4 weeks is achievable and if the filing is clean enough to survive immediate scrutiny. Right now it's not. There are 3 structures in the current architecture that need another 6 weeks of work before they're defensible. "I know." "The third option," she said. Adrian was quiet for a moment. "The third option is that we give Holt something she doesn't have, something that makes your cooperation so valuable that the terms you can negotiate are significantly better than what the voluntary approach gets you." Vanessa looked at the federal building. A woman in a dark coat was pushing through the revolving door, briefcase in hand, moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Vanessa watched her until she disappeared inside. "You're talking about the Drexler connection," Vanessa said. "I'm talking about what you know about the Drexler connection that isn't in the Moretti documentation." She was quiet. The Drexler connection was the piece of the Moretti operation that she had never committed to paper. Not because she'd anticipated this specific situation, but because certain things she had understood instinctively to be too dangerous to document. The relationship between the Drexler crew and the Port Authority officials who facilitated the pharmaceutical operation. The money that moved through a specific set of accounts she had been asked to build and had built with her eyes deliberately half closed. The name of the federal official on the Drexler payroll, whose identity she had pieced together from 3 separate conversations she was not supposed to have been paying attention to. She had never written any of it down. She had never spoken it aloud. It lived in her memory with the same quality as everything else she had absorbed in 12 years of invisible operational life. Precise, retrievable, and completely undocumented. "If I give Holt the Drexler material," she said, "I'm not just giving her Damien. I'm giving her a federal official. That changes the nature of the investigation. It goes to a different level, and it does not go back." "Yes," Adrian said, "and it makes me a cooperating witness in an investigation that will last years and will involve testimony and a profile that I have spent my entire adult life making sure I don't have." "Yes." She pressed her fingertips harder against her thigh. The cold was pressing through the car window despite the heat, and she could see her breath in the air in front of her for a moment, before it disappeared, and she thought about the radiator ticking in the Wicker Park apartment, and the second-hand desk, and the 10 weeks of work she had been building toward the thing she had told herself she was building, a name on a structure, a visible role, the thing that was actually hers. And she thought about what Celeste Vaughn's photographs of Damien's laptop had done to that timeline. "I need to think," she said. "I know. I need to think alone." Adrian looked at her for a moment. His face did the thing it did when he was being careful. The stillness deepened. The conserved energy became something more concentrated. "I'll take you back," he said. "I'll walk," she said, and opened the car door before he could respond. Dude. She walked north on Dearborn in the December cold without her mind on where she was going, which was not her normal mode. She almost always knew exactly where she was going, but she needed the cold, and she needed the movement, and she needed the specific discipline of a body in motion to organize the thing that was happening in her thinking. She walked for 40 minutes. She passed the river and kept going north into the neighborhood, and she walked along streets that were doing their ordinary morning business. Coffee shops with fogged windows, a dry cleaner with a hand-lettered sign in the door, two men loading a truck with boxes that clinked in a way that suggested glassware. And she thought about Celeste Vaughn sitting in the federal building and the photographs on Damien's laptop and the build history of the Cayman subsidiary with her own handwriting annotated in the margins. She thought about what she had known and not known about the person she'd been in those years. She had told herself a particular story about her own role in the Moretti operation, that she had been a technical architect, a builder of structures, that the moral weight of what those structures facilitated was carried by the decisions she hadn't made and the orders she hadn't given and the violence she'd never touched directly. She had told herself this story carefully and consistently for 12 years, and she had believed it in the way that people believe things they need to believe in order to keep functioning. The cold worked its way through her coat. She had been part of it. That was the truth that the federal file with her name on it was making undeniable. Not in the way that Damien was part of it, not with the blood and the territory and the direct operational decisions, but in the specific way that made the whole thing possible. The financial architecture that laundered the money and legitimized the holdings and made the syndicate look, from the outside, like a collection of successful businessmen. Without her work, Damien's organization would have been significantly more exposed, significantly more vulnerable, significantly less sophisticated. She had built the shield. The things that happened behind the shield were on Damien, but she had built it. She stopped walking. She was on a residential block somewhere in the Gold Coast. She'd walked further than she'd realized. The neighborhood had changed around her without her noticing. And she was standing in front of a brownstone with a black iron fence and a bare linden tree in the front yard. And there was a child's bicycle locked to the fence post with a combination lock, a small red bicycle with training wheels still attached. And she looked at it for a moment that stretched. She took out her phone. She called Marcus Webb. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been waiting for her call. "The Drexler material," she said, "specifically the official. Walk me through what you know from your side." A silence. Then, "How much trouble are you in?" "Walk me through what you know." Marcus was quiet for another moment. She could hear him breathing, the particular careful breathing of a man choosing his words with the precision of someone who understands that certain words, once spoken, cannot be taken back. "I know the name," he said. "I've known it for 2 years. I didn't—" He stopped. "I made the choice not to act on it because acting on it would have meant acting on everything else, and I wasn't ready to do that." "Are you ready now?" "Damien is finished, Vanessa. You know that. The organization is finished. There's nothing left to protect." Another pause, longer. "Are you talking to Holt?" "I'm talking to you. But you're considering it." She looked at the red bicycle with the training wheels. She thought about the word permanent, about how rarely anything was, about the specific human compulsion to believe that the current arrangement was going to continue indefinitely, right up until the moment it didn't. "If I do this," she said, "I need you with me. Your documentation plus my testimony on the build history plus the Drexler material, that's a package. Individually, we're assets. Together, we're the whole picture." "That's a significant thing you're asking." "I know." Marcus was quiet for so long she thought the call might have dropped. Then, "I'll call my attorney today," he said. She ended the call. She stood on the Gold Coast sidewalk with the cold coming off the lake and the bare linden tree moving slightly in the wind, and she made the decision the way she had always made the decisions that mattered. Not dramatically, not with the sensation of a door closing, but with the quiet internal click of a structure that has been building toward a particular configuration, finally reaching it. She was going to talk to Karen Holt. Bosita. She got back to the Wicker Park apartment at noon. She changed her coat and made coffee and sat at the desk, and she had been there for 20 minutes when someone knocked on the door. Not the intercom. The door itself, which meant they'd gotten through the building entrance without buzzing up, which meant either someone had let them in or the lock on the ground floor entrance had failed again the way it occasionally did in cold weather. She crossed to the door and looked through the peephole. Damian Moretti was standing in her hallway. He looked like he hadn't slept in longer than Marco had. He was wearing a coat she didn't recognize, not his usual, something darker and less tailored. And his face had a quality she had never seen on it in 12 years. Not defeat exactly, something more destabilized than defeat. The look of a man for whom the fundamental operating assumptions of his life have stopped being reliable. She stood at the door for a moment. Then she opened it. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he hadn't looked at her in years. Not through her, not past her, not at the version of her that was useful to him in the current moment. Directly, with the specific exhausted attention of a man who has run out of the energy required to look at anything else. "How did you find this address?" she said. Marco. Marco, who she had told she wasn't coming back. Marco, who had nodded and gotten in the elevator and gone, she had thought, to deliver that message to Damian. Marco, whose loyalty she had apparently miscalculated in the specific way that people miscalculate loyalties when those loyalties have competing directions. She filed that away. "You need to leave," she said. "I need 5 minutes." "You had 12 years. You don't get 5 more minutes." He put his hand on the door frame, not blocking her. His body language was not aggressive, which surprised her, because Damian's default response to resistance had always been to increase force. He looked diminished by something, hollowed at the center. "The federal investigation," he said. "You know about it." "I know about most things, Damian. That was always the problem. They have the Cayman documentation. They have the build—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "They have your work. Your name is in it." "I'm aware. I can fix it." He said it with the conviction of a man who has been telling himself this for long enough that the telling has begun to feel like the same thing as the truth. "I have people who can adjust the documentation. I can restructure the attribute—" "Stop!" He stopped. She looked at him in the hallway with the cold apartment air against her back and the fluorescent light of the corridor making him look older than he was. And she felt something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, a compound of both that had no clean name. "If you tamper with federal documentation at this stage," she said, "you move from the category of person the investigation is about into the category of person the investigation is specifically designed to destroy. Do you understand the difference?" "I can't." His voice cracked slightly on the word. He controlled it. "If they have your work attributed to you directly, you're exposed. I'm not going to let— You don't let or not let anything regarding my life anymore." She said it without heat. That was important. She said it the way she said things that were simply true. "You stopped having that authority when you walked into the Meridian Grand with Celeste Vaughn on your arm and announced to 200 people that I was optional." Something moved across his face that she might have found devastating in another version of her life. Not regret. Damian was not capable of the sustained self-examination that produced genuine regret, but the more immediate pain of a man confronting the specific cost of a specific choice. "I was wrong," he said. "Yes. I didn't understand what you were. What you actually—" He stopped again. His hand on the door frame tightened. "I built the wrong thing. I chose the wrong person. I understand that now." "I know you do. That's the part that happens too late, Damian. That's always the part that happens too late." He looked at her for a long moment. The hallway was very quiet around them. Somewhere below, the building's heating system made a sound like distant percussion, rhythmic and indifferent. "Is there someone else?" he said. The question landed in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not because it hurt her, but because of what it revealed about him. That in the wreckage of his organization, in the face of federal exposure and the collapse of the alliances he'd spent years building, this was still a question that occurred to him, still the thing his mind moved toward. "Go home, Damien," she said. "I don't have a home." "You were the home." He said it without drama, which made it worse somehow than if he'd said it dramatically. "I didn't understand that until you left. I understand it now." She stood with her hand on the door and looked at the man she had spent 12 years inside a life with, and she thought about the child's bicycle with the training wheels, and the radiator ticking, and the 14-page memo she had sent to Reeves 3 weeks ago with her name on it, and Marcus Webb saying, "I'll call my attorney today," and the specific quality of the click she'd felt standing on the Gold Coast sidewalk when the decision had finished forming. "Hire a good attorney," she said. "The best one you can find. Not Marcus. Marcus is going to have his own situation to manage. Someone new, someone clean, someone who hasn't been inside this world before. And whatever they tell you to do it exactly. Don't improvise. Don't think you know better. For the first time in your life, listen to someone who is trying to help you." He looked at her. "That's the kindest thing I have left for you," she said. "Take it." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it in the narrow hallway of the Wicker Park apartment, exactly as she had stood after Marco left. And she breathed, and she waited until she heard his footsteps moving away down the corridor toward the elevator. And she listened to the elevator come and open and close and descend, and then she was alone. She pushed off the door and went to the desk and sat down. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the directory for the Federal Public Affairs Office, and she found the Organized Crime Unit listing, and she found, 2 lines below the unit header, the name of the supervising special agent, Special Agent Karen Holt. She looked at the name for a moment. She thought about what she was about to do and what it meant and what it would cost and what it would produce. She thought about the build history and the Cayman documentation with her handwriting in the margins. She thought about Celeste Vaughn in the federal building explaining structures she had photographed without understanding, explaining them to people who were now trying to understand them, and the particular dangerous inaccuracy of a detailed account given by someone who didn't actually know what they were looking at. She thought about her name on the cross-organization restructuring that she had spent 8 weeks building and that she had not yet finished. She picked up her phone. She called Daniel Reeves. "I need you to arrange something for me," she said when he answered. "Not through your normal channels, through an attorney who has no existing relationship with the cross-organization. Clean, new, no prior exposure." "All right," Reeves said carefully. "I want a meeting with Special Agent Karen Holt. Voluntary approach. Represented, cooperative posture from the first contact." She paused. "I'm going to need immunity language that covers my role in the Moretti financial architecture. In exchange for that, I'm going to give her the Drexler material." Reeves was quiet for a long moment. "The full Drexler material. All of it. Including all of it," she said. Another silence. She could hear him processing it, the specific quality of a careful man running the implications forward and finding, at the end of the run, that the implications were very large. "This is going to change the nature of the investigation significantly," he said. "I know. It's going to take everything apart, not just Moretti. The Drexler crew, the Port Authority relationship, the official. I know what it will do. And you want to—" "I want my name off the table," she said. "I want to finish the work I'm building. I want to stand in front of something with my name on it that doesn't have this attached to it." Her voice was steady. She made it steady. "I want the life I'm building to be clean. And the only way to make it clean is to go through this, not around it." Reeves breathed on the other end of the line. "I'll make some calls." "Today," she said. "Today," he confirmed. She ended the call and set the phone on the desk and sat with her hands flat on the surface of it and looked at the winter light coming through the Wicker Park apartment window, pale and thin and very clear, the kind of light that shows you exactly what's there without any flattery or softening. She was going to cooperate with a federal investigation. She was going to give testimony that would dismantle what remained of a world she had spent 12 years inside. She was going to put her name on a statement and stand behind it, which was the most visible thing she had ever done, the absolute inversion of 12 years of deliberate invisibility. The thought did not paralyze her. She picked up the Harbor Point documentation and found her place in it, and she went back to work because there were still 3 structures in the cross architecture that needed 6 more weeks of attention, and she had apparently compressed that timeline to something considerably shorter, and the work was the only thing that had ever consistently told her who she was when everything else was rearranging itself around her. Outside, the December afternoon was moving toward dark early the way December afternoons did, the light thinning and the street below getting quiet, and somewhere on the other side of the city, Damian Moretti was in a car going somewhere she didn't know, and Celeste Vaughn was in a federal building explaining things she only partially understood, and Karen Holt was building a map that was about to get significantly larger, and Marcus Webb was on the phone with his attorney, and Adrian Cross was sitting in the River North warehouse with his hands on a long work table waiting to hear what she had decided. And Vanessa Holloway was at her desk in the fading light, working, with her name finally beginning to mean something she had chosen for herself, and the hardest part of what came next still waiting just ahead of her like a door she hadn't opened yet, but already knew she was going to walk through. The attorney's name was Claire Soto, and she had never represented anyone connected to organized crime in her 12 years of federal practice, which was precisely why Reeves had found her, and precisely why Vanessa had agreed to use her. Claire Soto was 41 years old, compact, with the kind of focused stillness that came from years of sitting across tables from federal agents and knowing exactly how much to say and when to stop saying it. She had an office in the Loop on the 23rd floor with a view of the river that Vanessa did not look at because she was looking at Claire Soto's face, reading it the way she read all faces, for the information underneath the information being offered. "They'll want the meeting fast," Claire said. She had Vanessa's preliminary statement, 2 pages, handwritten, the bare architecture of what Vanessa was prepared to offer, on the desk between them, and she was not looking at it because she had already read it 3 times. "Holt is going to push for within 48 hours. I'm going to push back to 72. You need that time to be certain about what you're giving them and how you're framing it." "I'm certain now." "You think you're certain now. There's a difference." Claire folded her hands. "Once you're in that room and Holt starts pulling on threads, the certainty you have sitting here looks different than it did. I need you prepared for the thread pulling, not just the opening statement." Vanessa looked at her. "I've been in rooms with harder people than Karen Holt and come out with everything I brought in and a few things I didn't have before." Claire looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not doubt, but a recalibration, the specific adjustment of someone who has just received new information about the thing they're dealing with. "All right," she said. "Then you understand that the moment you start, you finish. There's no partial cooperation in a case this size. If you give them the Drexler material, you give them all of it. The official's name, the account structure, the communication chain. Half a picture is worse than no picture because half a picture makes you look like you're managing them, and the one thing you cannot afford is to make Holt feel managed. I'm not going to manage her. I'm going to give her everything I have and make sure she understands what she's looking at. And the cross-organization. The cross-organization is separate. The restructuring I've been doing for the past 8 weeks is legitimate work. I can document the timeline, the scope, Holt is going to ask about it anyway. She's going to want to know the full picture of your activities since you left the Moretti household. You need to have that answer ready, and it needs to be clean. It is clean. Does Adrian Cross know you're here?" Vanessa paused for exactly 1 second. "He knows I'm approaching Holt. He knows the general shape of what I'm offering. He doesn't know the specifics of this conversation because this conversation is between me and my attorney." Claire nodded slowly. "The cross-organization's exposure in the current investigation, how significant is it?" "Moderate. There are structures in the existing architecture that would attract scrutiny if the investigation expands in that direction. That's part of why I'm doing the restructuring. The work I've been doing cleans those structures. By the time the investigation reaches that level, there will be nothing to find." "That timeline, how confident are you in it?" "I need 4 more weeks. Holt may not give you 4 more weeks." "Then I need to make sure she understands that 4 more weeks of my uninterrupted work is worth more to her long-term position than moving immediately." Vanessa held Claire's eyes. "The Drexler material is the opening, what I can build for the cross-organization. A legitimate, clean, fully documented financial architecture that demonstrates exactly what a criminal organization looks like when it makes a genuine transition to lawful operations. That's the closing argument. If Holt is as good as her reputation, she'll understand the value of having a live case study. Claire was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the river moved gray and cold 23 floors below, carrying its patient indifference through the middle of the city. "You've thought about this more than most people think about anything," Claire said. "I've had time," Vanessa said. Tim. The meeting with Karen Holt happened on the third day, in a conference room on the 7th floor of the federal building on Dearborn Street that smelled like recycled air and burned coffee, and the particular institutional neutrality of spaces designed to make everyone in them feel equally exposed. Holt was 50, sharp-featured, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that moved with the same cataloging efficiency Reeves had shown in the cafe. Except where Reeves had been discreet about it, Holt was completely open. She wanted you to know she was assessing you. That was part of the technique. She had 2 agents with her. Vanessa had Claire. Holt looked at Vanessa's preliminary statement for 30 seconds and then set it face down on the table. "You built the Cayman structure," Holt said. "Not a question." "Yes." "The build history has your handwriting in the annotations." "Yes." "And you're here because you want immunity for your role in the Moretti financial architecture in exchange for cooperation." "I'm here because I have information that is material to your investigation and potentially to a broader federal case that your investigation doesn't currently know it's the beginning of," Vanessa said. "The immunity is a condition of my providing that information, not the primary reason I'm providing it." Holt looked at her with the specific flat attention of a woman who had heard a great many people characterize their cooperation in terms that flattered their motives. "What broader case?" "The Drexler crew's relationship with a federal official whose identity is currently not in your investigation." The room was very still. One of the 2 agents shifted in his chair. The other one didn't move. Holt's expression did not change, which told Vanessa that Holt was very good at her job, because the information Vanessa had just offered was the kind that should have produced at least a flicker of something. "Name," Holt said. "Not until the immunity language is finalized and signed." "We don't sign before we know what we're getting." "You're getting the name of a federal official on the Drexler payroll, the account structure through which the payments were made, and the communication chain I can reconstruct from memory. You're also getting Marcus Webb, who has independent documentation that corroborates the payment structure." Vanessa folded her hands on the table. "What you're getting is a case that is significantly larger and more consequential than the one you currently have. The immunity language for my role in the Moretti architecture is the price of admission." Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the face-down preliminary statement on the table. Then she looked back at Vanessa. "Give us the room," she said to her 2 agents. They left. Claire stayed. Holt leaned back in her chair and looked at Vanessa with an expression that had shed the technique and become something more direct. "You understand what happens to people who come into this office and overstate their material. I understand what happens to federal investigations that move without the complete picture. I'm offering you the complete picture. In exchange for your personal protection. In exchange for documented immunity. Yes. And the Cross Organization." Vanessa met her eyes. "The Cross Organization is in the process of a legitimate restructuring that I have been engaged to build. When that restructuring is complete, it will be among the cleanest financial architectures of any organization in this city. I need 4 weeks to finish it. 4 weeks during which I'm supposed to leave Adrian Cross outside the scope of this investigation. 4 weeks during which the investigation focuses on the Moretti collapse and the Drexler material, which is where the genuine criminal exposure is. The Cross Organization's prior activities fall well within the scope of what a reasonable immunity framework would cover if you're getting the Drexler case in exchange." Holt tapped her index finger on the table once, twice, a third time. "You're asking me to give you 4 weeks and full immunity for Moretti work in exchange for a name and a payment structure you're going to reconstruct from memory. And Marcus Webb's documentation. Webb hasn't confirmed his cooperation. He will. He called his attorney 2 days ago. You'll hear from Webb's counsel within the week." Holt looked at her for what felt like a very long time. The recycled air hummed through the ceiling vents. The burned coffee smell was getting stronger, or she was just noticing it more. 4 weeks, Holt said. "If the restructuring is as clean as you're representing it, And if Webb's documentation corroborates your account, and if the name you give me checks out, I'll have something for your attorney to look at." "The name checks out," Vanessa said. She gave it. Passé. She was outside on Dearborn Street with the cold hitting her full in the face before she registered that her hands were shaking. Not badly, a fine tremor she could control if she closed her fists, which she did, standing on the sidewalk outside the federal building while Claire spoke on her phone 3 feet away, negotiating the preliminary terms with Holt's office. She had just given a federal agent the name of a sitting federal official. She stood with her fists closed at her sides and breathed the December air and felt the shaking move through her hands and up into her forearms, and then, slowly, subside as her body processed what her mind had already integrated. It was done. The thing was done. There was no version of the next 4 weeks in which this was reversible. She opened her hands. She called Adrian. He answered before the second ring. "How did it go?" "4 weeks," she said. "Holt is going to look at immunity language." A pause. She could hear him breathing. "And the organization? You're going to be fine. The restructuring needs to be done in 4 weeks, not 6. I need full access to everything. No delays on documentation requests, no routing through Reeves. You have it, all of it." Another pause, different in quality from the first. "Vanessa, I'm all right. I didn't ask." She stood on the Dearborn Street sidewalk with the federal building behind her and the river 2 blocks west, and the city moving around her in the December cold, and she felt something shift in her chest at the simplicity of that. "I didn't ask," at the way he'd heard the performance of "I'm all right," and declined to accept it without rejecting it either. Just named the gap between what she'd said and what he'd actually been saying. "It was hard," she said, quietly. The truth of it, unmediated. "I know," he said. "I'll be in the office at 6. "I'll be there," he said, and let her end the call without filling the remaining space with anything. The 4 weeks were the hardest work of her life. Not because the work itself was beyond her, but she had done harder technical work inside the Moretti organization with less time and fewer resources. The difficulty was the simultaneity of it. She was building the cross-financial architecture with one hand and cooperating with a federal investigation with the other, and the two processes were separated by a wall she had to maintain with absolute vigilance, because any contamination in either direction, any appearance that the restructuring was being shaped by knowledge of the investigation rather than legitimate financial strategy, or any suggestion that her cooperation with Holt was being limited by her relationship with Adrian, would collapse both. She worked 18-hour days. She ate at the desk. She slept in 4- and 5-hour increments and woke with the specific disorientation of someone whose dreaming mind had been working the same problems as her waking mind, blurring the line between them. She drank too much coffee and not enough water, and she was aware of both things, and corrected neither because correction required bandwidth she didn't have. Adrian noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly. He brought food she didn't ask for, and left it on the edge of the work table and never mentioned that he'd done it. He answered her calls at any hour without audible irritation. When she worked through meetings they'd scheduled and failed to acknowledge she'd done it, he rescheduled without comment. She was aware of this care being extended to her the way you're aware of warmth after cold. Not as a dramatic contrast, but as a steady presence that you notice most in the moments when you're too tired to maintain the habit of not noticing. On the 19th day, Marcus Webb's documentation arrived through Claire's office. It was comprehensive beyond what she'd expected. Marcus had been meticulous in ways she hadn't anticipated. He had kept records of the Drexler payments organized by date and account and cross-referenced against the Port Authority schedules, which meant the payment trail was not just corroborated but mapped with a precision that would make Holt's case significantly stronger than it needed to be to meet the threshold for charges. She called Marcus directly for the first time in weeks. "You kept everything," she said. "I'm a lawyer," Marcus said. "We keep things." "Marcus, why didn't you act on this earlier?" A silence. The long kind with something real inside it. "Because Damien was—" He stopped, started again. "Because I had spent 23 years building something with him, and even when I knew what it was, I wasn't ready to be the person who ended it." His voice was steady, but she could hear the weight underneath it. "You were braver than me. You left. I stayed and told myself I was being pragmatic. She didn't say anything for a moment. You're being brave now. I'm being pragmatic now, he said. There's a difference. But she could hear, under the self-correction, that he didn't entirely believe it. Odd. On the 26th day, Damien moved. She found out through a source she hadn't expected, a text from an unknown number that contained 3 words and a time. Reeves, tonight, 9 p.m. She called Reeves immediately. Damien's attorney contacted us this morning, Reeves said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, tight, controlled, the voice of a man managing urgency. He's requesting a direct meeting with Adrian, tonight. Through his attorney. His attorney made the initial contact. Damien is requesting to come himself. Vanessa stood very still at the work table in the River North warehouse, with a document she'd been annotating in her hand and the pen still touching the paper and the ink making a small spreading mark where she'd stopped moving. What does he want? He says he has information about the federal investigation that he wants to trade directly, not through Holt's office, through Adrian. He wants to trade it for what? For Adrian's assurance that the Cross organization will absorb the remaining Moretti territory under terms that protect Damien's personal position from further exposure. Vanessa set the pen down carefully. The spreading ink mark on the document was the size of a small coin now. She looked at it without seeing it. He's trying to broker a deal outside the federal process, she said. Yes. That's obstruction. Yes. He's panicking. His organization is essentially gone. 3 of his senior people have already flipped. Holt served papers on 2 of his legitimate business holdings yesterday. Reeves paused. He's desperate. She thought about Damien standing in the hallway of the Wicker Park apartment with his hand on the doorframe and his face with that hollowed quality and saying, I didn't understand what you were. She thought about what desperation looked like in a man who had never before been required to feel it, who had built his entire identity around the certainty that he would never be in the position he was now in. Tell his attorney that Adrian will meet with him, she said. Reeves paused. You want, tell him 9 o'clock. Here, and tell Reeves to make sure Claire Soto is notified before the meeting begins. She picked the pen back up. If Damien is going to propose something that constitutes obstruction, I want my attorney to know it happened before it happened. Vanessa, Reeves's voice was careful. You're going to be here. Yes, she said. I'm going to be here. Tian. He came at 9:03. She heard him before she saw him. The elevator, the footsteps, the particular sound of a man trying to move with his old authority and not quite managing it. Then the doors opened and he was in the room and he saw her and stopped. Adrian was standing at the far end of the work table. She was standing to his left, 1 step behind. The position she had occupied for years at Damien's side, now occupied at Adrian's, and she watched Damien register that with something that moved through his face like weather. You live here now, Damien said. It wasn't quite what he'd meant to say. She could tell. I work here, she said. He looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at him with the stillness she had come to understand was not passivity. It was the active, deliberate withholding of unnecessary energy. Damien was used to men who met his presence with competing presence. Adrian simply existed in the room without adjusting himself to accommodate Damien's entry into it, and she could see that this disoriented Damien in a way that a more aggressive response would not have. You know why I'm here, Damien said. Sit down, Adrian said. Damien sat. Not because Adrian's tone demanded it, it didn't, it was completely level, but because there was something in the room that Damien didn't know how to stand inside anymore. He sat at the far end of the work table and he put his hands flat on the surface, and he looked like a man who has spent his life at the head of tables and is now sitting at the wrong end of one. The federal case, Damien said. Holt is going to file within 2 weeks. What she has from Celeste is enough to charge me, but the case is, it has weaknesses, documentation gaps, things that could be challenged if the right pressure were applied in the right place. By the right place, you mean outside the legal process, Adrian said. By the right place, I mean through channels that people in our position have always used to manage. I'm not in that position anymore, Adrian said. This organization is in the process of a legal restructuring. We don't use those channels. Damien's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to Vanessa, and she held them without expression. You did this, he said. The words were quiet, which was worse somehow than if he'd been loud. You came in here and you changed what this was. She improved what this was, Adrian said. She's building you something clean with the knowledge she built for me dirty. The words came out harder now, the desperation finding its edge. Everything she knows, she learned inside my organization. Everything you're going to have, it's built on what she took from me when she walked out. The room was very still. Vanessa breathed once, deliberately. She thought about 12 years. She thought about the Meridian Grand and the burgundy dress she hadn't chosen and the 2 rings on the kitchen counter. She thought about what it meant that even now, even here, Damien's framework required her to be something he had made rather than someone who had made herself. I didn't take anything from you, she said. I took back what was mine. The knowledge is mine. The skill is mine. The 12 years of work are mine. What you had was the benefit of all of it, and you had it because I gave it to you, and I stopped giving it to you when you made it clear it wasn't wanted. I never said it wasn't. You said it in the Meridian Grand in front of 200 people without using a single word. Her voice was even. She made it even. And I heard you. Damien looked at her across the work table with the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he can't take back and knows he can't take back, and is looking for an angle of approach that doesn't require him to acknowledge that. I need your help, he said finally. The flattest, barest version of it. I know you do. Then, the answer is no, Damien. He stood up from the chair so fast it scraped back against the floor, a harsh sound in the quiet room. And for 1 second she saw the man who had built an empire through force of will and force of presence, and the absolute conviction that there was no situation he could not reshape to his advantage through the application of enough pressure. For 1 second he was that man again completely, not diminished, not hollowed, but Damien Moretti at full operating capacity, standing in a room and refusing to accept the answer he'd been given. Adrian took 1 step forward, not toward Damien, not aggressive, just 1 step, which changed the geometry of the room slightly, which put him alongside Vanessa rather than behind her in the work table. And Damien looked at that 1 step, and something went out of him as if a switch had been thrown. He stood there breathing. You chose him, Damien said. He said it to Vanessa. I chose myself, she said. He happened to be building something I wanted to build. Damien looked at Adrian with an expression that contained more than she could fully inventory. The hatred of years, the specific agony of a man watching the person he'd undervalued standing beside the rival he'd always feared, the compounding weight of understanding, finally and completely, the dimensions of what he'd thrown away. He looked at that for a long, terrible moment. Then he picked up the chair he'd knocked back, and he set it precisely back in its position at the end of the work table. A strange, particular gesture, almost formal, the gesture of a man performing the last available version of control. And he walked to the elevator without another word. The elevator doors opened. He stepped in. The doors closed. The room was silent. Vanessa realized her heart was pounding. Not fast, just hard, each beat deliberate and separate, as if her body was counting them. She breathed through it. She felt Adrian's stillness beside her. Not a hand on her arm or a word, just his presence in the room as a steady thing. And she breathed through the pounding and let it slow. He's going to go to Holt, she said. Yes. He's going to try to negotiate his own position. He'll give her what he has on the Drexler connection and try to position himself as the primary cooperator. He doesn't have what you have, Adrian said. He didn't know you knew the official's name. No, but Holt will have to run it down regardless. It'll add time to the timeline. Does that change your position with Holt? She thought about it. She thought about Damien walking into the federal building on Dearborn Street and sitting across from Karen Holt and trying to sell her what he had, and Holt looking at it against what Vanessa had already provided, and the specific expression Holt would have when she understood the difference in quality between the two accounts. No, Vanessa said. It doesn't change my position. She turned back to the work table. She found the document she'd been annotating. She found the ink mark where she'd stopped, the small spreading stain that had dried while the evening happened around it. She picked up the pen. "We have 9 days left on the restructuring timeline," she said. "The third structure, the hospitality portfolio vehicle, it's close, but the back-end documentation on the real estate subsidiary needs one more pass before it's clean enough to file." Adrian moved to his side of the table. He sat down. He opened the folder in front of him and found his place in it. "Walk me through the documentation issue," he said. She walked him through it. Outside the north window, Chicago was doing what it always did. Indifferent, enormous, burning its lights against the January dark, while the people inside it made their choices and lived inside the consequences of those choices. And the river moved beneath the bridges, and somewhere on the other side of the city, a man who had once been the most powerful person Vanessa Holloway had ever known was sitting in the back of a car trying to decide whether he had anything left worth trading. And in the River North warehouse, 9 days from the end of everything she had been building toward, Vanessa Holloway sat across a work table from a man who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was, and she worked. The filing went in on a Thursday. Vanessa knew the exact moment it happened because Claire called her at 8:47 in the morning while she was standing at the window of the River North warehouse with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hand, watching the January sky do its flat gray thing over the city, and Claire said, "It's done. The restructuring documentation is filed and time-stamped. The immunity agreement is fully executed. Holt's office has confirmed receipt of the complete Drexler package." A pause. "It's done, Vanessa." She stood at the window for a moment after she ended the call. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. 9 weeks. That was what the last phase of her life had cost in calendar time. 9 weeks from the night she'd stood in the hallway of the Wicker Park apartment with her back against the door after Damien left, to this Thursday morning with a cup of cold coffee and a view of Chicago from the 4th floor of a building that now belonged, legally and cleanly and with full documentation, to a restructured organization whose financial architecture bore her name in the filing, not as a note in the margins, not as an anonymous annotation in a build history. Her name, in the primary documentation, as the architect of record. She stood at the window and she felt the weight of that, and it did not feel the way she had imagined it would feel when she'd been doing the work and telling herself what it would feel like. It felt quieter, more ordinary, like arriving somewhere after a long drive and finding that the place looks different from the approach than it looks when you're actually standing in it. She heard Adrian come into the room behind her. She heard him set something on the work table, a sound she had learned to identify. The specific weight and placement of the folder he carried when he had documentation to review. And then she heard him stop moving, which meant he was looking at her back, which meant he was doing what he sometimes did, which was read her before he spoke. "It filed," she said, without turning. "I heard from Reeves," he said. "The immunity is executed." "Yes." She turned from the window. He was standing at the end of the work table, the folder in one hand, looking at her with the expression she had come to know well enough over 9 weeks to read its specific register. Not satisfaction, something more careful than that. The look of a man who knows that the thing he is watching is significant and is being deliberate about not overloading it with his own response. "We should talk about what comes next," she said. "We should," he agreed, "but not today." She looked at him. "Why not today?" "Because today you should go home and sleep for longer than 5 hours, and tomorrow we can talk about what comes next." He set the folder on the table and looked at her steadily. "You've been running on adrenaline and bad coffee for 9 weeks. The thing that needed doing is done. Give your body a day to understand that." She almost argued with him. She felt the familiar pull of the work, the specific anxiety of stopping when there was still structure to be maintained and strategy to be developed. The anxiety of a woman who had learned, somewhere in the years when she was building invisible things for a man who didn't see her, to equate motion with safety. She recognized it for what it was. "All right," she said. He nodded once, and something in the room settled. Trot. She drove back to Wicker Park through January streets that were ice-gray and sparse, the kind of morning that emptied the city of its usual density and left only the people who had somewhere they absolutely needed to be. She parked the car and climbed the stairs and unlocked the apartment door and stood in the narrow hallway with her coat still on for a long moment, feeling the specific silence of a space that had only ever been hers. She thought about the Lincoln Park townhouse, the 4 floors and the limestone facade and the study on the 3rd floor where she'd kept the leather portfolio in the bottom drawer. She thought about the weight of that place. Not the physical weight, but the accumulated weight of the years inside it, the decisions made and unmade, the silences that had grown larger over time until they were the primary thing that filled the rooms. She did not miss it. She had expected at some point in the last 9 weeks to miss it. To feel the specific grief of a long chapter ending, the way you feel the end of something even when the ending was necessary. But what she felt when she thought about that house was not grief. It was something closer to the feeling you have when you set down something heavy you've been carrying for so long you forgot you were carrying it. Not loss. Relief so deep it had settled below the level of conscious sensation and become simply the baseline condition of existing in your own body. She took her coat off. She made tea, real tea, not coffee, and she sat at the secondhand desk that she had come to think of as simply her desk, the possessive no longer requiring the qualifier, and she looked at the surface of it, the water rings, the small gouge near the left corner she'd noticed on the day she bought it, the way the grain ran in a direction that caught the winter light at a particular angle in the early afternoon. She thought about what Adrian had said the night before, when Damien had left and the room had settled back into quiet, and they'd worked for 2 more hours on the documentation. And then at 11:30, Adrian had looked up from the folder in front of him and said, without preamble, "I want to tell you something." She'd set down her pen. "Tell me." "When Reeves first brought me the idea of approaching you, after you left the Moretti household, I said yes because the analysis was sound. You had operational knowledge and technical skill that I couldn't find anywhere else. It was a strategic decision." "I know," she said. "I want you to know that it stopped being a strategic decision a long time before now." He held her eyes with the directness he always had, the quality of someone who had decided to say a thing and was saying it without hedging. "What I think of you now has nothing to do with what you know or what you can build. I want that to be said plainly because I don't think you've had many people in your life say things to you plainly." She had looked at him for a moment, the work table between them, the documents, the coffee machine and its Italian curves, and the bookshelves organized in the order he'd read them. She thought about what it meant to be seen plainly, not as an asset, not as an architecture, as a person. "I appreciate plain," she'd said. "I know you do." They had sat with that for a moment, and then she had picked up her pen and he had turned back to the folder, and they had worked for another 40 minutes before she left, and nothing about the exchange had been dramatic, but it had landed in her the way certain true things land, quietly and at depth and without announcement. She sat at the desk in the Wicker Park apartment with her tea and thought about that. Damien Moretti entered a cooperation agreement with the federal government on a Tuesday in February, 19 days after Vanessa's filing. Claire called to tell her. She was brief about it, the nature of the agreement, the terms, what it meant for the scope of the investigation going forward. Damien had given Holt what he had, which was not the full Drexler picture that had already been Vanessa's, but was enough supplementary material to deepen the evidentiary record and give his attorney something to work with in the negotiation over his own exposure. "What does he get?" Vanessa asked. "Reduced on the primary charges. He'll serve time." The attorney was realistic about that to his credit. "The legitimate business holdings are forfeit. The organization is dissolved by court order." Claire paused. "He cooperated on everything except one thing. He refused to characterize your role in the financial architecture as criminal. His attorney says it wasn't a negotiated point. He just wouldn't do it." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "He told Holt that the Moretti organization's financial decisions were made by him, under his authority, and that your role was technical execution of his directives." Claire's voice was careful. "It wasn't required. Holt already had the immunity framework. He volunteered it." She sat with that for a long time after the call ended. She did not know what to do with it. This information about a man she had left and was not going back to and did not want back, who had done, in the wreckage of everything, one thing that was not required of him. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn over an object you found somewhere unexpected, trying to understand its origin and what it means that it exists. It did not change anything. It did not rewrite the years or the gala or the burgundy dress sent by an assistant with a note that said, "Wear this and nothing else." It did not change the rings on the kitchen counter or Marco in the hallway or the hollowed face she'd seen in the doorway of the Wicker Park apartment. But it was something. She let it be something without making it more than it was. She put it down. Betrayal. The federal investigation ran for 16 months in total. During those 16 months, Vanessa was called to testify on 3 occasions. She prepared for each session with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to financial documentation. Not anxious preparation, not the rehearsal of someone who is afraid of the questions, but the organized readiness of someone who has decided to be honest and wants to make sure the honesty is expressed with precision. She sat in the witness chair each time with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she answered what was asked and did not embellish and did not minimize and did not look at Damien's attorney across the room with anything other than the neutral attention she gave to every person in the room who asked her something she was going to answer. The 3rd session was the hardest. The 3rd session was the one where Damien's attorney asked her, on cross-examination, whether she had loved her husband. She had looked at him for a moment. Claire had objected on relevance grounds. The judge had considered it and overruled. She had thought about the question with the same seriousness she brought to every question that deserved it. "Yes," she said, "for a significant portion of the marriage. What I felt at the end was something different from love, but it wasn't nothing. That distinction matters to me even if it doesn't matter to this proceeding." Damien's attorney had looked at her and she had looked back at him, and he had moved on to the next question. She had not looked at Damien during the session. She was aware of him in the room the way you are aware of weather, a condition of the environment, present and real, but not something you directed your attention toward. When she left the building after the 3rd session, she walked to her car and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. The city was in early spring now. March, with the particular tentative quality of Chicago in March, the cold not gone, but losing its conviction, the light staying longer in the evenings with the cautious tentativeness of something that has been burned before and is not yet sure it's safe to come back. She started the car and drove north. The Cross Organization's public restructuring was announced in April in a press release that Vanessa wrote herself over the course of 3 evenings at the River North warehouse, revising it 7 times before she was satisfied with its precision. The announcement described the organization's transition from private holdings to a registered international security consulting and investment firm, with offices in Chicago, New York, and a newly established European branch in Amsterdam. It listed the firm's leadership structure. It listed as chief financial architect and partner the name Vanessa Holloway. The announcement went out on a Wednesday morning. By afternoon, she had received 43 emails and 11 phone calls, most of them from people in the financial and legal world who had heard her name in the context of the federal investigation and were now encountering it in a different context and were recalibrating accordingly. She answered each one with the same composed efficiency, scheduling meetings, providing documentation, establishing the professional architecture of a relationship between the name and the work it represented. Marcus Webb called at 4 in the afternoon. "I saw the announcement," he said. "Yes. Your name first in the listing." "Alphabetical," she said. "Cross, then Holloway." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Sure." A pause. "I'm proud of you. I want you to know that, for whatever it's worth from someone who should have done better by you a long time ago." She thought about Marcus in the ballroom at the Meridian Grand, telling her it had been 6 weeks, telling her the announcement was going to come at the end of the quarter. She thought about the exhausted sadness in his face when he'd said, "I know you were," after she'd told him she was fine. "It's worth something," she said. "Good." He cleared his throat. "I'm setting up a small practice. Just myself and 1 associate, nothing ambitious. Elder law, estate planning, clean work." "That suits you." "I think so too." Another pause. "Take care of yourself, Vanessa." "You too, Marcus." She ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of the warehouse office, which was no longer just Adrian's office, but had been reorganized over the months into something that functioned for both of them. Her desk along the east wall, his at the north end of the work table, the bookshelves that were now a mix of his reading order and her reference materials, interspersed without either of them having made a deliberate decision about it. The Italian coffee machine on the counter. She had learned to use it properly. It had taken 3 weeks. Okay, the wedding was small. Not because there was anything to hide or because the circumstances called for discretion. The federal matter was resolved and the public announcement had been made, and the cross organization's new incarnation was operating with a clean posture and full regulatory compliance. The wedding was small because that was what both of them wanted, and neither of them had needed to negotiate that into alignment with the other. It had simply been true for both of them from the beginning of the conversation, which itself told her something about the nature of what she was stepping into. 14 people in a restaurant on the near north side that Adrian had chosen because the owner was someone he trusted, and the room had good light in the evening and the food was honest. No ceremony she hadn't written herself. No performance for the benefit of a room full of people assessing her place in a hierarchy. Claire Soto was there, which Vanessa had not expected and which moved her more than she'd anticipated when Claire walked through the door. Daniel Reeves was there. 2 of Adrian's people from the early organizational days who had stayed through the restructuring and who treated Vanessa with the straightforward professional respect of people who had watched her work up close for a year and drawn their own conclusions. Tina Park was there, which made Vanessa smile when she arrived. Tina in a green dress, slightly overdressed in the best possible way, looking around the room with the bright, careful attention of a woman who paid attention to things, which was the quality that had made her useful to Vanessa and was also, separate from utility, the quality that made her someone worth knowing. And Marcus Webb was there, which had not been planned, and which she understood when he arrived, slightly late, slightly rumpled, with a bottle of wine that was better than anything on the restaurant's list, was his own version of saying the thing he'd said on the phone, but in person, where it would cost more. She had not invited anyone from the Moretti world. There was no Moretti world anymore, not in any form she recognized, and the people who had populated it had dispersed into whatever came after the thing they'd built their lives inside collapsed. She did not think about them as a group. She thought about them occasionally as individuals. Marco, who she'd heard had relocated to Phoenix and was working in legitimate security management. 2 of the Belanti associates who had cooperated with the investigation and received reduced exposure. The coat check attendant named Derek, who she hoped was still working his way through DePaul's accounting program and whose name she still knew because she had always asked. The dinner was 3 hours long and louder than she'd expected, and at some point in the second hour she looked around the table and counted the people there who knew her actual name. Not the married name, not the organizational role, not the federal witness designation, but the specific human configuration of skills and flaws and hard-won knowledge that was Vanessa Holloway. And the number was 14, which was 14 more than she'd had a year ago. Adrian was watching her when she came back from that thought. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He had the quiet look, the one that meant he was registering something he decided not to immediately put words on. "You looked somewhere else for a moment." "I was counting." "Counting what?" She looked at the table. Marcus arguing cheerfully with Reeves about something she wasn't tracking. Claire Soto holding a glass of wine and looking like a person who had spent the week in courtrooms and was experiencing the specific physical relief of not being in one. Tina Park leaning toward the person next to her with the bright, attentive tilt of someone who has just discovered an interesting conversational thread. "People," she said. He looked at the table too, and then back at her, and he understood without her explaining it, which was not a small thing. She had spent 12 years beside a man who needed everything explained to him in terms of his own interests before he could receive it. Understanding that arrived without the translation step was something she was still getting used to. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly. Not a gesture for the room, nobody was watching, just for her, just the weight of it. She turned her hand over and held his for a moment, and then they let go and picked up their glasses, and Marcus was saying something that made Claire laugh, and the evening continued. She went back to the River North warehouse on a Monday morning 6 weeks after the wedding, which was the first Monday after the Amsterdam office opened, and the first morning that the Cross organization, the firm, the legitimate documented entity that bore her architectural signature, was operating across 3 time zones simultaneously. She sat at her desk along the east wall. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the financial monitoring dashboard she had built for the new structure, and she ran the morning reconciliation the way she had begun doing every morning, a 20-minute process that told her the state of everything she had built with a clarity that still surprised her. 6 months in, the clean satisfaction of a structure that worked exactly the way it was designed to work, that held its shape under the weight of actual operation. Everything was as it should be. She leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. A very old industrial ceiling that Adrian had never refinished because it was genuinely beautiful. Dark beams and the ghost of old brick and the particular character of age that can't be manufactured. She had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing things that become part of the backdrop of your daily life. She noticed it now. She thought about the leather portfolio she had left in the bottom drawer of the desk in the Lincoln Park townhouse. She had never gone back for it. She had occasionally wondered what had happened to it, whether Damien's people had found it and given it to his attorneys, whether it had been absorbed into the federal evidentiary process, whether it was sitting in a storage unit somewhere in an evidence box with her handwriting still in the margins. She had built it as a map, and she had memorized what she needed from it and walked away. And it had served its purpose by existing even though she'd never needed to use it directly, because the knowledge that it existed had given her a specific quality of calm in the years when she'd needed calm to do the work. She didn't need it anymore. Whatever container it was in now, the knowledge it held was hers, had always been hers, and the act of walking away from it without taking it had been its own kind of statement. Not dramatic, not for any audience, just the private assertion of a woman who understood the difference between the record of her intelligence and the intelligence itself. She heard Adrian come in. She heard the specific sound of his arrival, the elevator, the footsteps, the way he moved through the room with his own economy and ease, the folder on the work table, the coffee machine beginning its process. And she felt the simple, unremarkable fact of it. This person in her space, this consistent presence that had not once in all the months of knowing him required her to be smaller than she was. "Amsterdam is up," she said, without turning from the ceiling. "I got the notification," he said. "The Brower contact came through on the preliminary agreement. Reeves is flying out Thursday to finalize. Make sure he has the amended terms. I sent them last night." "He has them." She heard him sit down at the work table. The sound of the folder opening. Then, after a moment, "The Harwick property chain. The final transfer record came through this morning." She sat up from her ceiling contemplation. "Clean. Completely clean. The auditor's sign-off is attached." The Harwick property chain. She had first mentioned it to Marcus Webb in the Meridian Grand Ballroom on the night of the gala, standing near the dessert table with the empire she'd built collapsing in real time around her, telling him the transfers needed to close by the 15th, or they'd lose the tax position. Those had been the Moretti transfers, which had not closed by the 15th, which had become part of the evidentiary record that had since been resolved and discharged. The Harwick properties had eventually been acquired through the cross-restructuring, legally, through a process she had designed, and the final transfer record now bearing the auditor's sign-off was the last piece of that acquisition closing. The same name, a completely different thing. She thought about that for a moment, the way the same components could produce entirely different structures depending on who was building them and what they were building toward. "Good," she said. She turned to her desk. She opened the monitoring dashboard again and looked at the Amsterdam numbers alongside the Chicago numbers, alongside the New York numbers, the 3-column view she'd designed so she could see the whole organism at once, and she felt the specific deep satisfaction of something built correctly. Not the satisfaction of completion, because nothing that lived was ever complete, but the satisfaction of structure in motion, holding its shape, doing what it was designed to do. She thought about the woman who had stood in the November dark outside the Meridian Grand, breathing the cold air with the exhaust from the catering trucks, and the noise of the event muffled behind the door, counting the minutes. That woman had known something she couldn't yet fully articulate, had felt the click of a decision forming before she had the language for what was being decided. She had counted 4 minutes. She had gone back inside. She had done the rest of the evening the way she'd done 12 years of evenings, competently, invisibly, at no personal cost she was willing to acknowledge to herself. And then she had stopped. She had stopped, and she had driven away, and she had cried briefly on the highway, and she had arrived somewhere new, and she had begun, in the particular stubborn, methodical way that was her nature, to build. The radiator in the Wicker Park apartment had ticked. The second-hand desk had had water rings. The light had come through inadequate windows, and she had sat in it anyway, working, because work was the thing she knew, and the thing that organized her, and the thing that, in the end, had turned out to be the skeleton of the life she actually wanted, the one that was hers, that bore her name, that stood when you put weight on it. She was putting weight on it now. Adrian's coffee machine finished its process with the sound it always made, a soft, efficient completion, and she heard him pour 2 cups, and she heard him cross the room and set one on the edge of her desk the way he sometimes did, and she picked it up without looking away from the screen and drank it, and it was good, and the morning was already doing what mornings did in the River North warehouse when the work was real, moving forward, purposeful, ordinary, in the way that only hard-won things ever get to be ordinary. Outside the north window, Chicago was deciding to become spring. She had watched this city from 100 angles over the years, from the high floors of the Meridian Grand, from the back of cars moving through syndicate business, from the inadequate windows of a Wicker Park apartment, from this warehouse in the 4th floor morning light. It had never asked her permission for anything. It had not adjusted itself when she suffered inside it or celebrated when she rebuilt. It had simply continued, enormous and self-occupied and various, a city doing what cities do, which is hold the whole impossible range of human experience simultaneously without distinguishing between them. She did not need the city to distinguish. She knew what she had done. The morning light came through the north window and laid itself across the work table in a long stripe, catching the edge of the folder Adrian had been reading and the surface of the coffee machine and the spine of a book on the shelf, whose title she could read from here. She had added it herself 3 months ago, and it sat between 2 of his in the chronological order he kept, now part of the sequence rather than separate from it. She turned back to her screen. She had a 9 o'clock call with the Amsterdam contact and a 2 o'clock with the firm's outside counsel on the quarterly compliance review and a documentation request from the New York office that needed a response before end of business. And the morning was already arranging itself into the shape that days had when they contained enough real work to make them worth the hours. She opened her calendar. She opened the New York documentation request. She read it once, identified what was needed, began to type. She was not thinking about the gala. She was not thinking about the burgundy dress or the rings on the kitchen counter or the 4 minutes in the November dark. She was not thinking about Damian Moretti, who was somewhere in this city serving the first year of a sentence that had been reduced by his cooperation, and which he would serve and finish, and after which he would live whatever life remained to him, diminished and altered, and free of the empire that had consumed everything around it when it fell. She was not thinking about any of it, because the past was a country she had already left and paid the full price of leaving. And the price had been real, and the leaving had been necessary, and the life that existed now on the other side of that passage was the life she had built with her own hands, in her own name, alongside a man who had never once asked her to make herself smaller, so he could feel larger. She was thinking about the documentation request from New York. She was thinking about what it needed and how to answer it, and what the answer would produce downstream in the structure she had built, the elegant, specific, load-bearing structure that worked because she understood how structures worked and what they needed to hold their shape when the weight of real life was applied to them. She typed. Adrian's chair shifted at the work table. Paper moved. The morning held them both in its ordinary light. Vanessa Holloway typed the last line of the response, reviewed it once, and sent it. Then she picked up her coffee, and she went back to work.